Hello, how are you? Good. So, just before we start, one small question: are there some people that do not know about Flutter at all, or very little? Okay, there are some people, so you will need to catch up on some things because this topic we'll assume that you know at least some basics of Flutter. And today we're going to talk about Flutter for desktop, which is one of the ways of using Flutter. But before that, let me introduce myself. So I'm Dominik, and I'm a Flutter developer. I've been using Flutter for almost 2 years now. Before that, I was a Xamarin developer, .NET developer. For like 6 years, I've been deputy manager of student satellite project, and we sent our satellite into space in 2018, and it's still working on the orbit. And also, I am organizing Flutter Warsaw meetup. We have monthly meetings, so if you're from around, please think about joining us. And also, I'm one of the organizers of this conference. You can find me online on my website and on Twitter. So if you want to follow some Flutter news or some challenges or on something like that, I'm on Twitter and my handle is on the bottom left here, Oristis Gaolin. So so as I said, I'm one of the Flutter Warsaw organizers. So if you want to join the Flutter Warsaw or even Flutter Poland community, there are some places like Meetup, group on Facebook and Slack. So if you want to take a picture of, for instance, some links, you feel free to be invited. We have very active community right there. Okay. So now straight to the topic. So today I'm going to talk about Flutter for desktop. I'll give you a quick overview of what actually Flutter for desktop is and what it means to me, because there is no definition what it actually is. Then we'll show some quick start, how to actually start with Flutter, how to run your first application. And then we're going to talk about current limitations and current advantages of Flutter for desktop. Beforehand, we will have a quick overview of possible use cases that people right now are using Flutter desktop for. And I think that's pretty interesting, so please wait for this part. At the end, I'm going to talk what can we expect in upcoming months about Flutter for desktop, what are my wishes, what is going on in the Flutter repository about Flutter for desktop. So with this quick overview, I think we can start with what actually Flutter for desktop is. So just before we start, there's a question to audience, and I expect you to answer this. So how do you think, can Flutter for desktop be used on production right now? No. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a valid answer, but I think that during the presentation we'll try to answer this. So, do you think that Flutter for desktop will be usable for production this year? Okay, so you have mixed opinions, and I think we are going to clear things up today. Okay, so just to have a quick overview of Flutter for desktop. So Flutter for desktop, in my definition, is a Flutter working on macOS, Linux, and Windows. So these three platforms are considered by me as Flutter for desktop. There are, of course, some other ways to run Flutter. So for instance, you can run Flutter on Raspberry Pi, or there is an embedder written in Golang that allows you to run Flutter on various platforms. But in this talk, we're going to focus on macOS, Linux, and Windows. And what's good about Flutter for desktop? It's like the very Flutter that we know. All the good parts of Flutter, like widgets, like widget tree, hot reload, hot restart, small application size, high performance, all of these parts are working right now in Flutter for desktop. But Flutter for desktop is still an experiment. It's still unstable. Although in December, Flutter for macOS entered the alpha stage during Flutter Interact, but it's still only on master or dev channel available, and Linux and Windows are still not supported officially. So it's a little bit risky, or I say it still requires a lot of manual work to start Linux or Windows application in Flutter. Also, very important thing that plugin API is still not stable for Windows and Linux. There will be some significant changes. So I'm going to talk about plugins later. But if you want to create plugin for Windows and Linux, you have to cope with the fact that in month or 2 months they may be not usable, and you will have to rewrite at least some layers of the plugin. So if you want to start using Flutter for desktop, you should go definitely to one place on GitHub, which is Flutter Desktop Embedding Repository. This is a project repository that was initially some experiment on trying to run Flutter on desktop platforms. Right now, most of the activities are available in Flutter Desktop Embedding Repository. The link is on the bottom of the slide. But since Flutter for macOS entered the alpha, some issues, some things moved to main Flutter repository. So if you want to track some issues, for instance, related to macOS adaptations in Flutter, so things that, for instance, work only on macOS, you should go to the main Flutter repository. So just to compare, there is like 350 issues like in total related to desktop in Flutter repository, and I think now there are like 7,000 open issues in Flutter project. So you can compare the numbers are significantly different. And one important problem when you are starting with Flutter for desktop, that there is very little documentation about it. The knowledge is scattered across many places. Like I said, there are 2 repositories. There are some other projects that want to experiment with Flutter for desktop. There are some wiki pages. Some of them are unfortunately outdated. And there are some Google Docs and sometimes even tweets that have some very important knowledge. So when I was researching the topic some time ago, I was having like tens Chrome tabs open at the time, because the spots where you could find the knowledge were so different. Okay, so I think that at this point we all more or less understand what Flutter for desktop actually is. And now I'm going to show you how to run your first Flutter desktop application. So some of you may have realized that this very presentation is actually Flutter application. So and this works pretty okay on macOS. So in order to run this application on macOS, there is only one step. You just switch to the master or dev channel of Flutter and press F5 or something other or some other button that allows you to run your application, and everything should work. At least in theory. And if you want to run your basic application that you created with Flutter, you should be able to do it just by using Flutter create and then just running. However, if you want to run it on Windows or Linux, there are many more steps to go through. So, for instance, you can, clone the Flutter desktop embedding repository that has already Linux and Windows projects configured, and try to run them. Usually, if you have everything pre-installed, like Visual Studio 2019 toolchain on Windows and some packages on Linux, you should be able to run it. But from my experience and from other people that I know, it usually takes at least a few hours to set everything up on Windows and Linux. One important thing is that if you have macOS, then you can be having your macOS application much faster than on other platforms. But it's possible, so you just need to be patient and fix all the issues. And again, there is no documentation, proper documentation. There are just like main points that you need to do. So for now, you need to experiment a little bit on your own. Oh, there is one important thing. Linux support is only, I think, for Ubuntu-like systems because of the GLFW OpenGL library. And if you use Linux, for instance, I don't know, Fedora or Arch, you can have some issues, additional issues related to running Flutter. So Ubuntu, Debian, something like this. Another issue that you can encounter when starting the application in Flutter Desktop is that currently there is only macOS in supported target platforms inside Flutter. So Flutter actually doesn't know how to show widgets, what widgets show to on Linux and Windows, so you have to override it. And if you use the Flutter Desktop embedding repository, then this is already set up. But if you want to create your own project, you will have to override the variable called debug default target platform override. Yes, so that's the way to run on Windows and Linux, and I spent a lot of time on Windows trying to fix this issue. Okay, so at this point you should be good to go, right? It seems like pretty easy thing to do. Only a few hours if you have Windows, and you should start writing your application in Flutter. And I said at the beginning that most of the good parts of Flutter work, right? So it seems that you could write Flutter application right now. But actually, it's not so simple. There's one issue that is very big issue. So plugins. For those that do not know what plugins actually are, these are packages that interact with native platform. So for instance, you can have plugin for camera that allows you to use your video camera on your phone in Flutter. Or you could have some plugin to shared preferences of your device, because this is a very native feature and you need to translate this to be understood by Flutter. So plugins for Flutter for Desktop allow you to interact with the platform native features, like, for instance, clipboard or maybe local notifications on system. So there's one problem, that there are no plugins for Flutter for Desktop. So let's discuss this current status. So there is only like 9 or 10 official Flutter plugins for desktop, and I could fit them all on this slide. So you have, for instance, window size, shared preferences, connectivity, and as you can see, most of them is only supported for macOS right now. Some of them are supported on Windows, and some only on Linux. As you can see, not so many, and most of them is pretty useless, like you don't usually use the color picker in your applications. You could, for instance, use the material color picker. So this is a huge problem, that you don't have official support for plugins just yet. Of course, there are some plugins from community, like, for instance, Window Utils by Roddy Davis from Rive App, which is like very complex toolkit that allows you to, for instance, change the mouse pointer, change the window size, and so on. There are some others. Some of them are maintained. Some of them had some updates half a year ago. So you know, the situation is not so bright. And if you want to integrate with your native platform, and there are many things that you maybe don't even realize require native implementation, you will have to do it on your own, or wait for the community, or wait for the Flutter team to support this. So if you need to create a plugin, let's see how it actually is done. So there are a few steps. So again, we come back to this main repository called Flutter Desktop Embedding, which is like the source of knowledge when you start using Flutter for Desktop, and you use the example plugin that is already there. This plugin, unfortunately, supports only C++ and Objective-C, I think. So if you want to use, for instance, Swift on macOS, then you'll have to copy some other plugin that supports Swift. And if you want to use some other languages, which I don't think are supported right now, but you could theoretically write a plugin, for instance, in C#. But I think nobody has done this yet. So you need to use this plugin, and on macOS again, Flutter will handle everything for you. You just need to rename the plugin and you can start writing your code. On Windows and Linux, again, you need to do some manual work. So the Flutter will register the plugin in the application for you, but you need to change the project, native project, in order to this plugin to be built. So, for instance, on Windows, you will need to change the Visual Studio project in order to compile the plugin together with the application. Some instructions can be found in the wiki of the Flutter desktop embedding. And if you're going to write a plugin, for instance, if you are going to write it in Swift, it will be pretty straightforward. It is almost the same as writing a plugin on mobile. So in this code snippet, you can see a top part of one of the plugins. This is a plugin by Roddy Davis, Window Utils. It's written in Swift. And in this code snippet, you can see that you have just a static function that registers the plugin and registers the method channel called window utils. So method channel, for those that do not know, is a way to communicate between Flutter application and native code. And then you just have the function that handles all the calls from the Dart side. So for instance, I have a call hide cursor, and if I invoke this function, then my cursor will be hidden just by using native API on macOS. And on the Dart side, it's pretty simple. You just have the function called hide cursor, and you invoke this method on the channel, which is again called the same window utils. And Flutter will handle passing this message from Dart side to the native side for you. So creating a plugin is pretty simple. As it seems. The problem with that is that you need to know all the native APIs. You need to have knowledge not only for Android and iOS, which is relatively similar, like the concepts that you have on mobile are more or less similar across platforms, like notifications, maybe access to camera, and so on. But on desktop, this is much more different. So APIs for even using your mouse pointer, APIs for using clipboard, APIs for rich content in clipboard, or maybe using camera, some new permissions that are required on some platforms. They are completely different across Windows, Linux, and macOS. So the huge problem, the huge barrier is that you need to know all of these things. You need to know at least 2 different languages, and so on and so on. But of course, it's possible. You don't need to write a full application. You just need to handle some calls. Like if you need to use your clipboard, you will just read the content of the clipboard, and that's all. And handle some memory usage and so on. But all in all, it shouldn't be so complex. That's also the idea of plugins. Okay, so one part of my presentation will be devoted to some use cases. And let's think for a minute, what can we actually build with Flutter for desktop? So I was thinking about this for the last couple of months. And for me, for instance, I was just using Flutter for desktop for presentation, just like this one. And it worked pretty well. Sometimes I even, for instance, received a presentation from a speaker that he had wrote it on Windows or Linux, and I was able to run it without any problems on my MacBook. So it was pretty fun to see what is possible back then, what was possible back then with Flutter for desktop. But right now, more and more people are interested with this, and I asked several people that I know that are using Flutter for desktop, how are you using actually Flutter on desktop? What is your goal? How Flutter for desktop helps you? So the first case that I found out was that some people, some developers use Flutter for desktop to develop mobile apps without any device or any simulator. And that's pretty useful thing to do. So for like the main advantages of this are that you have very quick startup time, very high performance. You don't need to spin up emulator on your 8 giga. Like if you have 8 gigabytes of RAM, you cannot afford having Android emulator running side by side. And if you decide to use Flutter for desktop, you can just spin, I don't know, 50 or 100 megabytes of application, like RAM usage, and have very smooth performance. As I said, the performance impact on the dev's machine is very small, and you can have multiple applications open at the same time. The problem with that is that we don't have plugins, we don't have Firebase, we don't have notifications, we don't have camera, we don't have many things like Bluetooth. So you have to mock all of these things on your own. And of course, this can be a problem, but on the other side, it enforces some approach to decoupled architecture. Yes, so you can at the same time enforce yourself to maybe inject some services, maybe decouple some native implementation to some separate packages and just dynamically substitute one with another. And it can be much easier for testing. So if you run your Flutter application in Flutter for Desktop, you can test it on many form factors at the same time. So for instance, there is this package that works in Flutter for Desktop that allows you to have your application within different, let's say, frames of fonts and different systems. Yeah. So like right now, this application is running in iOS, and I can easily switch this to, for instance, some medium phone or even iPad, yeah, and I can see how this application behaves on different form factors. Of course, I could also just resize my window, but there are some issues with window resizing on Flutter for Desktop. And with this package by Alois Daniel, you can easily see your application running in many different form factors, or even on a watch, if you develop the watch application. So as you can see, many possibilities. If you, for instance, need to only create some layout. The second use case that is like closely related to the first one is that you can use your Flutter desktop application to perform UI tests. And from what I've heard, people are doing some amazing things with that. So for instance, they can run orders of magnitude more tests in the same time. So if you need to spin up simulator or emulator or something like this, and each time you have to wait for it to boot, because for instance, you run this test on your CI, it can take minutes or even more to even start the test. And with Flutter for Desktop, you can run your application within a minute or less. This test can be run, for instance, on Docker container. You can run them in Linux application, Flutter Linux application. Of course, the problem with that is that Linux is still very experimental. It will change, and you can spend much more time on fixing the issues than actually you will save by running the UI test on Docker. But you can do it, and maybe in a long term, it will be much more beneficial than running this on emulator. Case number 3, excuse me, I don't see my timer. Case number 3 is that you can start to develop a single platform application. So for instance, you can start developing macOS application, which is the easiest right now. And I know some people that are going this way, and they even started a few months ago. And what they say is that they can have much better performance than competitors. We know all well that we can write applications in Electron. There are some ways to use other cross-platform toolkits. For instance, you could even have some other Electron-like wrapper around your application to have it running on multiple platforms. But at least for now, and in current version and in current applications, they say that the performance is much better using Flutter. Of course, another problem is that there is only a few plugins, so they need to write it on your own. And the problem with that is these people that I know, they usually write these plugins for themselves. They are very coupled with the applications. So even if I ask them, would they publish this, they say that it's very closely related to the application that they are doing. So they are not allowed, for instance, to publish this right now. But I know that there are people that are doing this. And some of them, like for instance, in Rive app, they are sharing this on a daily basis, some new very great plugins that I'm gonna show a bit later. One nice thing when you are running Flutter application on desktop is that you can consume some native libraries that were written in different languages. So for instance, you can consume with Dart FFI, which is like a way to interact with, for instance, C libraries. So we can consume those libraries. For instance, they can be some kind of encryption libraries. They can be some networking tools. Yes, so you can write only a simple API in Dart for this library and consume this in your application. Some of these libraries are cross-platform, like FFmpeg. So, for instance, maybe you could use this on all of your platforms. So there are some very nice applications that can be done with consuming dynamically consuming your libraries. And like one issue at the end is that for now, Flutter is mostly touch-oriented. It was developed for the small form factors, for touch devices, and some things on desktop don't look natural. They are either too big, they have some issues with, for instance, selecting text. So here my mouse pointer, I don't know if you see this, but my mouse pointer is able to select some text. So the problem with that is that if I press my mouse pointer, the selection starts only like 50 or 60 pixels. And this is because on mobile device, you don't want to start selecting your text just after the tap on the screen. You want to wait for the user to actually start moving their finger. And on desktop, you're accustomed to like very immediate feedback. And for now, you cannot override this in a simple way. So you have this very unnatural thing that you start selecting your text, and this text is selected only after a couple of like maybe millimeters. Yeah. So that's a very strange feeling for a user. It feels like the application is having some problems. So there are many problems like this, maybe for instance with text input, with buttons and so on. So you have to bear in mind that for now, the number of widgets that have been adapted to macOS is very small. And the last use case that I was very excited and also amazed to see was that some people are using Flutter for desktop to build application with a common code base for web, desktop, and sometimes even mobile, but usually web and desktop. And yeah, for those people, brave move, good luck. I hope that you will succeed. This sounds like a very challenging task. But yeah, these people are developing application for desktop and web at the same time. And I hope that they will publish this year, or at least show some insight. And yeah, they say that aside from these issues that I listed through all my presentation, they are pretty happy with that. With current results, they of course spend a lot of time on their custom plugins. They understand that Linux and Windows will change, but that's the cost that they are ready to take. Okay, so I think that's there was a lot of like theoretical and like listing things. So for now, let's try to maybe build something. And yeah, so let me go to my oh shit, my Slack just opened. Oh no. Oh no, it's not Slack. It's just application, just simple mockup that I created for this presentation. And as you can see, you can easily have a layout like in Slack. I think I built it in one evening. So of course, this is just a layout, very simple thing, some messages. So there is a message from Anne. Hi guys, what do you think about the Flutter Europe conference? So I think you can answer them on Twitter. So maybe let's go to the Twitter. Oh, this is Twitter, yeah. So maybe during the presentation, if you want, you can post something on Twitter and this will appear maybe here. Let's see. So yeah, this is application made with Flutter, like only one screen. But if you hover your pointer over some things here, you can see that some things are actually like reacting to my pointer, like this list style is reacting. Some hover background change is happening. Actually, this list is a very big flat button. So that's why it is reacting to my mouse, because flat button, which is one of the buttons in Flutter, has this platform adaptation done. So it reacts to my mouse pointer. The same happens if I tap here, but this doesn't happen on any other. So here happens because I also use flat buttons, but it doesn't happen on some obvious things like these buttons here. Or when I hover my mouse over the photo, I expect it to open. Yes, like, and if I hover my mouse pointer and nothing happens, the user is usually not. He doesn't know what is actually happening. Maybe the app froze. So what we can do is to enable some platform adaptations on our own. So this application is prepared in a way that I can do it with one simple change. But usually what you would have to do, let me show you. So usually what you would have to do is wrap your widget. So here you can see this Slack image attachment. So actually this is, for instance, this image. And what you do typically is to wrap your widget with a widget called mouse region, and this works on desktop. This detects when the mouse pointer enters the area and when it exits. So you can just use some. Let's say now let's use Window Utils plugin to change the cursor. So I think that it should work right now. So as you can see, very simple change and completely different feeling in the application. I can feel that I can tap on this image and open this, for instance, in a web browser. Yeah, very simple thing, but it matters a lot. So I prepared some things in my presentation to show you what is actually possible. Yeah, this is a very long file. So what should I do? I know. I should tap on this button. And now, magically, this flag was changed to true. And everywhere where I had this flag, so let's say mouse here. So for instance, this flag now is true. So everywhere some changes happen. And if we take a look again at the Slack application, you can see that if I hover my mouse pointer over the text, it changes to this very narrow mouse pointer. The same happens if I hover this over the channels, over the members. I can see that my mouse pointer is changing. The same here. So as you can see, I created a small hover animation over these buttons. So this very small change here. You can see I can hover over this text field and it looks much more natural on desktop. So you have to remember and you have to design or implement your widgets in a way that will handle this desktop adaptation, because for now most of them is not supported. For instance, buttons have this adaptation. They have this flag called, I think, density or something like this, and you can use it to show much denser layouts on your in your application. And there is one more thing that I wanted to show about this application. So as you can see, it has a really like, let's say, not nice, not pretty top bar. Yeah, this up bar, it shows Flutter desktop example. And usually when you have a modern application, you want to have your custom up bar. And with usage of, again, Window Utils plugin, you can hide this title bar with one click. And now this application looks much more natural. It has this native controls on the top. These are native controls, so they work with macOS. And the rest of the application looks much nicer. Yeah, so that's me, funny. Yeah, so as you can see, very simple things that allow you to make your application much more natural, and you can do it, for instance, while you are waiting for the plugin support from the Flutter team or from community. Okay, I think I have like 10 minutes left, so let's share some tips and tricks when it comes to making Flutter on desktop. So as I said at the beginning, usually you should inject some mocks for your features that require some native features, again features. But for instance, Firebase is not supported on desktop. There are some ways maybe to use REST API. Some people say that maybe it could be possible to use the web plugins on desktop, and that way you could have a web-based Firebase plugin working on desktop. Yeah, but for now you just need to either mock this or implement some other way of handling data from Firebase. One very nice thing is that you should definitely use FVM. FVM is a tool that allows you to have multiple Flutter environments installed at the same time on your machine. So, as I said, if you want to use Flutter for desktop, you need to have master enabled, or at least dev channel enabled with Flutter. And when you switch between Flutter stable, Flutter master, Flutter dev, you always need to download the Flutter source code, build it, and it can take on some smaller machines up to 10 minutes to even switch from one channel to the other. And FVM, which is like available on GitHub, allows you to have separate environments, and after configuring this, you can switch between master, stable, and so on within seconds. And after configuring this in your IDE, you can run any application on any channel at any time. The third point is like a friendly advice. If you can switch to macOS, it's much more easy to write desktop application on macOS. But if you don't, then that's your choice. And try some example apps. There are like 2 or 3 example apps from Flutter team that show some basic ways of handling Flutter desktop application. Go to the Roddy Davis repository, go to the plugins that I shown before. Also, I invite you to the Slack where people are discussing Flutter desktop, because for now this community is very small, and you can see some examples. So, for instance, I saw that there's one developer, I think from Microsoft, that is trying to make Flutter working on UWP. UWP is like Windows 10 applications. So, because for now on Windows you need to run your Flutter application in Windows 32 application, and this is like pretty obsolete, and they are trying to make it work on UWP. So there are some people that do it right now. Experiment with that. So when it comes to this UWP, I couldn't make it work on my machine, but maybe soon, in like a week or 2, it will be working. Okay, just before the end, maybe let's think for a minute what can we expect that will happen with Flutter for desktop in upcoming months. So this issue with platform adaptation. In Flutter project, you can see that there are tasks that handle the platform adaptation, platform specific look, behavior, some hover effects on desktop, and from what I've read, they're like expected to land in upcoming months in the stable, or at least dev and master channels. I expect that Flutter team will handle all of the basic things that are related to window management, maybe some mouse pointer management, clipboard. Clipboard is a very tricky thing. So in general, you just copy the data from one point to the other, but copying data from like that is not so trivial at in some cases, especially in case if you have some rich content or clipboard manager or something like this. We can expect some toolkit agnostic library for Linux. What it means is that for now the Linux is supported only on GLFW, which is a library that works that the Linux implementation works mostly on Ubuntu-like systems, and we hope that at some point Linux will be supported in other like Qt or GTK plus. So you could, for instance, have application written in your favorite. Embedded in your favorite window toolkit, and maybe run it on many different Linux distros. So for now, there is manual work required when you use Flutter on Windows and Linux, and we can expect some changes in that area. So perhaps Flutter tool will support both Windows and Linux soon. And I saw that there are some experiments with add to application. So this is also a very important use case. If you have a production application written, for instance, in Swift, maybe you would like to have some views that are made with Flutter and shared, or in Electron maybe, and you would like to share them across platforms with Flutter. So the same as it is working in mobile applications. And my personal opinion, what we would really wish would happen, so most of us use Firebase on a daily basis, so I hope that there will be some support for Firebase, official support, because for now you just have to make some hacks to make it work. Some people said that maybe there will be the Firebase in Dart, but from what I've heard, it's not possible. There won't be Firebase in Dart, at least from what I've heard. Maybe there will be this support for web plugins, but this is still like a very hot discussion topic. Nothing is set in stone just yet. I hope that there will be some big application on the market soon. Maybe one of the ones that I was talking about with people. And I hope that there will be this UWP support, because you can imagine that there are many, for instance, Xamarin developers or .NET developers that moved to Flutter, and they have this wide knowledge of .NET platform, and they could use it with Flutter while writing plugins or some parts of the UI. So as you can see, that's my hope. And ending, I have a few minutes left. During my interviews, I heard this really nice quote that I would like to share with you. So everybody needs a good cross-platform solution for desktop, but it doesn't exist just yet. And Flutter might be this solution. Still might, yeah. It still isn't the solution, but it might be the solution in upcoming months. And with this optimistic thought, I'd like to leave you, and thank you very much for your attention. If you want to ask some questions, there will be time during the break. I will be somewhere here around. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a great conference.